call black everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today via Skype by Professor Jeffrey Q. McCune, Jr., Associate Professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Program and the Department of Performing Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor McCune is the author of Sexual Discretion, Black Masculinity and the Politics of Passing. That's the University of Chicago Press, 2014. How are you doing today, Jeffrey?
I'm great. I'm very happy to be here.
So talk about this new book of yours, Sexual Discretion. I mean, one of the interventions that you make in this book, you know, because this idea of black men on the DL, on the down low, has circulated in the culture in very interesting ways for the last 20 years or so. But you have really recovered it as a site of possibility as opposed to a site of pathology, as so many folks choose to talk about it, at least in terms of popular culture and popular media. So talk a little bit about the book for a second.
Yeah. Well, you know, the idea was to think about the down low in some more complex ways than we had heard in media, right? This manifestation that kind of came out of media, and folks were talking about these down low men who are, of course, almost like distributing HIV/AIDS, right, within the black community. And so that was the impetus. I was interested in first how it was that mythology was being perpetuated and distributed. But then I also was interested in actually how it is that the men lived from day to day, right? So my thinking was that so many people were connecting the down low to the closet. And for me, the down low and the closet were two different constructions, because the men with whom I would speak when I started doing interviews would say things like, I didn't have a closet to come out of. Or they would say things like, I'm not in no closet, I'm me. And when I first heard that, I didn't know what to make of it, but then I started thinking more theoretically about it. And I realized that the closet was just another carceral space for a lot of black men, and particularly living in the times we live in, where we're thinking about carceral spaces and thinking about you know, these kind of containers for blackness. I refused the closet, and I did it because so many of the men with whom I spoke refused the closet. And so that was the beginning of the book. But I definitely wanted to produce a book that was in some ways peripatetic, following the discourse, right? So the discourse took me to the club. The discourse took me online with the guys. The discourse took me to the passing novels, right? Because there were sisters that were saying, you know, these brothers are passing for straight,
right?
You know, and I was trying to figure out, how is passing, you know, fitting into this conversation? And so the book tries to do a lot of things. It's largely ethnographic, but it's also, as you know, it's a discursive analysis, it's literary analysis, and it's in conversation with multiple fields.
You know, it's interesting. You just mentioned that, you know, you're really trying to complicate the conversation. And so we start with R. Kelly, trapped in the closet. You know, what does it mean to have a figure like R. Kelly, or maybe even Jael King in another context, to have those figures really be the people who kind of drive the discourse around sexuality in the black community at this point in time? That you know, most of the folks who've seen Trapped in the Closet have never read Kathy Cohen. You know, most of the folks who have read all of Jael King's various iterations of what's going on in his life will never read, you know, C. Riley Snorton or read Jeffrey McCune. You know, what does it mean that, you know, we have to look at the popular as the place where we have to really begin these conversations?
Yeah. Well, you know, the popular was most responsible for the discourse in the first place and for this conversation. I mean, you know, the down low existed, as I argue in the book, long before R. Kelly's On the Down Low, or even R. Kelly's Trapped in the Closet videos. Yeah. And so, you know, it's interesting to start with R. Kelly for a lot of reasons, right? And as you cite in your own book, you know, Looking for Leroy, you know, you talk a little bit about the ways in which R. Kelly, you know, operates in these kind of controversial ways. And I'm also interested in how it is that R. Kelly's persona as this kind of public controversial figure also plays with his ability to kind of propagate these narratives about DL men. And part of me, it definitely challenges me as a scholar to not only be able to deal with Kathy Cohen, but I also have to deal with the pedagogies of the street, right? And for the pedagogies of the street, for me, are, in fact, popular culture. And so when we talk about like Law and Order, when we talk about Trapped in the Closet, when we talk about the recent episode of How to Get Away with Murder, right? Even there we have the reincarnation of the down low. And so I think that, there's a way in which popular culture is keeping this thing alive. But for me, what I'm interested in is the ways in which popular culture admits some things that we may not see. Right. And so as you see, in the introduction, I try to show how Trapped in the Closet is making some admissions that I'm sure R. Kelly was not thinking about.
Right. You have this line where you talk about, what you're trying to do with the book is really to deal with the kind of silences around sexuality within the Black community and put that in conversation with the kind of unspoken sexual silences, the stuff that's happening within the Black community that no one wants to talk about. And there's the unwillingness of the Black community to talk about sexuality at all. Talk about navigating these spaces for you in your work. And again, yourself as an out Black man, what were some of the challenges you faced trying to find, on the one hand, the kind of scholarly distance that we, objective distance that we want from quote unquote scholars, but actually being invested in these communities, whether it be the Black community or a Black queer community, in real significant ways?
Yeah. The truth is, Mark, when I first started this project, nobody wanted to talk to me. And part of the reason why I think a lot of folks didn't want to talk to me was two things. I think on one level, it was the fact that I was outside of the community in some ways, right? Here I am, this scholar interested in talking to them about their sex and sexual practices and ways in which they think about themselves. But the truth of the matter was that I realized very early on that who I was performing as Scholar Jeffrey, right, going into these places, young ethnographer, trying to change the discourse, right, that just didn't work. Right? It just didn't work. And so part of what I spend time talking about is the ways in which I had to embody, right, a somewhat of a kind of a different performance of masculinity. And part of it was what I had already known growing up in the South Side of Chicago, right? I had references, right? I had folks who I, could talk to. And if I'm honest, I had some folks in my background, I'll say, who I had engaged with, who I knew how to, present myself in a way that was going to be amenable to conversation. And so a lot of times what I was struggling with was trying to figure out how my gender performance could match up with the performances of the spaces that I was dwelling in and the men with whom I was speaking. And a lot of times it didn't work. And sometimes they practiced a critical generosity with me, right? Brother, you know what? I trust you. And that's what they would say, that, I trust you. And so through trust, I was able to create an ethnographic closeness, right, and kind of remove some of that distance. I think the other thing is a lot of times, people think about me, as you just said, out brother, but I actually sometimes even challenge my position in that, because I often find myself dancing and oscillating between being in and out, right, depending on where I am. And as a person who's in the ministry, a person who's, in a family that's somewhat close to issues of sexuality and conversations about sexuality, I also find myself often in this liminal space. And that liminal space allows me some connection.
And it's interesting because when you talk about your own performance, particularly around doing this ethnography, there's also, I think about the comment you just made of the brothers that would be like, I trust you. But there's also this kind of performance of Black respectability that you do that, that I think also probably allowed you to be able to circulate in some of these communities, much easier had you been tethered to other kinds of performances.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's also very interesting because I think that I find myself, I've rehearsed a performance for many years of The Preacher's Kid, right? And there's a way in which you learn very early on how to talk to people, right? How to get people to relate to you and to trust you. And I definitely think that that's definitely coded with respectability politics, right? I definitely think that there was some of that.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Jeffrey Q. McCune, Jr., Associate Professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program in the Department of Performing Arts at WashU in St. Louis, the author of the new book, Discretion, Black Masculinity and the Politics of Passing, University of Chicago Press. I can remember a time about a decade ago, Jeffrey, and I was sitting in a theater at Northwestern University where you were a student, and I was sitting there watching a musical, a play that you had written and produced on the down low. And the most striking moment for me about that play, and when a whole bunch of things came together for me, is this moment when 50 Cent's In the Club comes on. And it's like everything, suddenly I understood the power of that song. I understood how someone like 50 Cent, Curtis Jackson, circulates in these multiple communities. And of course, you have this wonderful chapter in the book, Out in the Club. Talk about the dynamics of how some of these men are navigating sexuality. I remember, Michael Musto years ago did a piece on hip hop and queer communities in New York City in the Village Voice. And he had this great line where he talked about, you could be gay in hip hop, you could be gay in the hood, but you couldn't be a faggot in the hood. And it really spoke about, how do we talk about gender performance within the context of same-sex desire? So talk a little bit about the ethnography and the work that you did looking at this stuff playing out in the club.
Yeah. That scene was dynamic for a lot of reasons. And I call it a scene because it definitely was a scene of action unlike anything else I experienced. And that's why I recorded it in the book. And that moment that you're talking about where, the whole crowd gets together and screams, faggot ass nigga, right? Yeah. The chorus of 50 Cent's song in the club. That moment was so complex and so layered. And what I was battling against was my initial reading was to read that as this moment of internalized homophobia by gay people. Right? And I think that's the immediate move, right, whenever we think about those moments. But what happened was that I realized that there was commentary there about gender, there was commentary there about race, there was commentary there about collectivity, right? The importance that all these same gender-loving folk were convened together. Even at the same time, they were convened around hip-hop music, right? And the fact that they were actually coming together, right, around this music, and particularly this moment that was somewhat of a joke, right? I actually found out later, that for some people, right, saying faggot ass nigga was actually a joke in the moment because they were very well aware that each of them at different moments had been faggot ass niggas, right, to somebody. Yeah. Right. And so there was a moment of agency here. And I think that moment of agency also remarked for me about the ways in which men on the DL and men who practice discrete sexual relations also find agency within these kind of more truculent gender performances. Right. That the confines of that performance can't be so overdetermined. And I think that we have defined it so much as being a very closeted identity, a very constrained identity, and that these men actually do in that club and in life find moments of agency.
You use that moment where you talk about hip hop and DL identity in the club, to create this very interesting kind of theoretical framework, what you call architecture. Unpack that for the audience if you can.
Yeah. So this is funny because I was just reading an article recently and someone picked up the term architecture and started using it. And I was really like, oh my God, they're using it. I like that. and one of the things I love about you know, how that term manifested was really me doing the kind of Godscaping of the club, right? I'm looking out at the architecture. I'm seeing, you know, the folks upstairs, and then I'm looking down at the dance floor, and then I'm looking to my right at the way the bartender is serving, and all these, and the way the structure of the bar is kind of above the people, right? Like all of this stuff I'm thinking about in terms of hierarchies and dynamics, and all of a sudden I realized that there was something about the space that had a texture to it, right? It wasn't just physical. It also had a texture, a character to it that was written with various codes, right? And what I was interested in is how it is that the one word can articulate what happens in space and what space feels like, what space tastes like, what space, how space operates. And architecture was that word for me, architecture, right? To get at both, you know, the physical and the feeling, the affect. And so I really, you know, was grateful to the folks who were able to speak with me and work with me to allow that type of language to manifest.
What do we do with figures like Jael King, who for far too many people is the face of DL identity, and not in any way that's productive or progressive,
Right.
you know, more self-serving and exploitive more than anything. But, you know, when you have these kind of radical shifts, if you will, in our public sensibilities about life and family and identity, you're often going to get these kind of creatures of the moment like Jael King. You know, what do we do with figures like that?
Well, you know, some of us ignore them, and then some of us really spend a lot of time trying to undo the damage that they did, right? And so we still live with that, right? It is still selling, right, on the down low. When folks reference that, they're quick to say, go to see Jael King's book On the Down Low. And there are still some folks who actually teach it. I'm encouraging people to stop teaching it and to teach me and teach Riley, right? I want them to teach those books because they critically engage the subject matter. But I think one of the things that we can do with a Jael King and even a Elin Harris to a lesser degree is we can begin to think about these folks as a part of a genealogy, right? A genealogy of what I would call problematic constructions of Black men, right? And those who work with benevolent intentions, but still perform damaging effects, right? And I think that we have to be very careful. I'm really careful now, right? I understand that Jael King, you know, for the most part, had good intentions, but that did not erase the damaging effects that I think have become a part of the present conversation.
Later in the book, as you talk about the kind of constructions of Black masculinity that folks have to challenge, and you create this very interesting quintet of Eldridge Cleaver, Amiri Baraka, Minister Louis Farrakhan, Dr. Dre, and 50 Cent as almost being responsible for these kind of constructions of Black masculinity that in some ways we all have to navigate it, you know, on all sides of it. What do we do to get past, you know, what are these still very, very rigid notions of what Black masculinity is? You know, just to take an example from the sports world, you know, I'm a big fan of the Carolina Panthers, you know, their quarterback, Cam Newton. And I'll say, you know, Cam Newton's a beautiful man, right, on so many different levels. And he shows up, you know, in his lilac suit, you know, with his capris, and folks are like, what the hell is this? And it's like, you know, there's not even a space for him to even perform that without suddenly, you know, think about Dwayne Wade and responses to his guy. And we're just talking about clothes, right? We're not even talking about gender performance and sexual desire and all these kinds of things. We're just talking about dudes wearing clothes that they like.
Yeah, I think that, you know, for me, masculinity, right, is a production, right? And all of these representatives of masculinity inform who you and I, right, get to be. I think part of what we have to begin to do is try to find diverse representations, right, of Black masculinity that both our young people and our older people, right, can use as references for who it is that they wish to be. Now, part of what, gets me about the Cam Newton moment, right, is exactly what you said. The ways in which people quickly, right, gravitate towards judgments of sexuality, judgments of gender based on sartorial choice. And I think part of what we have to begin to do is police the policers, right? Begin to say that we can't continue to police Black men's sartorial choices because ultimately we are inadvertently limiting who they get to be in the world, right? And that's one of the other ways in which, we return back to the closet, right? These kind of carceral moments, because we are once again pigeonholing Black men in order that we're pigeonholing Black men in a way that they only get to configure their masculinity in particular ways. And so I think that that's part of what we have to begin to do is develop a new genealogy, right, of performances that are going to be understood as legitimate representations for models. What's
next for you, Jeffrey?
Well, what's next for me is a book entitled Read, an experiment in seeing Black, which actually, jumps off of the last conversation we just had about, what is important about removing these kind of canonical prejudices that we have of Black people, right? How do we get beyond the canon of prejudices, right? How do we get beyond the fact that hoodies represent, right, some ill masculinity? How can we begin to read more generously Black people's bodies and Black people's practices?
And you're at Washington University in St. Louis, so you've pretty much been at ground zero of Black political discourse now for 2 months. What has life been for you, both in and out of the classroom, kind of navigating all the energy, some of it negative, some of it, really serious community building, if we consider the Black Lives Matter, movement, that we're starting to see kind of really flourish, even with, Ferguson October. Talk a little bit about what it's been like being there and being who you are and the kind of energy that you're seeing, both from folks who are living in these communities, but obviously, of course, the students who are at Washington University.
Yeah. I am seeing a great awakening. My interpretation of this moment is that this is a moment that has enlivened so many people. Like, the people who were dead to these issues are now coming alive. I'm seeing coalitions that I've never seen. I'm seeing people coming from New York, from Europe, right, coming to Ferguson, Missouri. And for me, it's been about navigating, right, how it is that I can get the university to kind of respond and react to what's happening in Ferguson in some real concrete ways, right, give some commitment, some resources. But also it's been about being on the ground and letting folks know that there are some professors and some preachers and some other folks who are very much interested. I stayed up to 5 o'clock in the morning the other day, with brothers and sisters occupying another university, right? Because it's important that we stand for justice and stand up for these issues and really get America to realize that not only do Black lives matter, right, but that Black lives actually are, part of what makes America matter, right? It's not just that Black lives matter. It's also that our lives matter so much. They're integral, as you know, in your own work, and the work of so many other scholars, that so much of what we do, right, is only able to be done because we're alive. And so that's where I've been. I've been at this point where, in this in-between space, but very much it's real to me. And last thing I could say, Mark, is, I used to think of the sexual discretion as separate from that project, my social justice project. But then I started thinking about, when we have issues like this, where brothers are worried about, whether or not they're going to live tomorrow, questions of an out identity are just secondary, if not tertiary, if not even a part of their considerations. And I think that that's one of the things we have to think about is how sexual discretion, right, it becomes an opportunity, right, for brothers to negotiate the social constraints that they face within the world.
Always great talking with you, Jeffrey. We've been joined today by Professor Jeffrey Q. McCune, Jr., Associate Professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program in the Department of Performing Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author of the new book, Sexual Discretion, Black Masculinity and the Politics of Passing. That's the University of Chicago Press. Thanks for joining us today, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record.